let's talk about planning RPG stories using arcs. RPGs, whether they're tabletop or computer, are a little bit different than other kinds of stories. When you have other stories, there is a lot of cutting. You need to have a tight experience, whether it's a movie or a first-person shooter or a book. You often hear about how to make a lean story, one that flows well through a few pieces of heavy-hitting plot. But in an RPG, the opposite happens because the players live in that world. So your story has to contain a lot of content. And not only that, all of the content has to be threaded together in a way that is compelling and pulls the player forward. This is quite the tall order. I know a lot of people really struggle with this. There are people who have worked for thousands of hours to create their RPG story only to find that nobody likes it because it feels flat. This is also true if you follow some of the tutorials on how to create a good story, but those stories are supposed to be the kind of lean stories that you get for linear stories. If you follow those pieces of wisdom, you're going to end up with a very sparse, flat-feeling RPG story, because that's not how RPG stories are presented. RPG stories are a different sort of beast. So I figured I would show you a very basic way to plan out your RPG stories using arcs. This is not some kind of magical best way to always do everything, but if you find yourself working really hard and not getting very much story out of it, this is a way to work way less hard and get way more story. Okay? Let's give a demonstration. It's going to be a Halloween tabletop game, so we have 2 sessions, and the second session is on Halloween. And it's going to orbit around some kind of vampire lord story. That's going to be our basic final goal. Now, at this point, some people are already starting to cringe because vampire lords kind of feel overdone, right? We need something more unique, like we could have a vampire Elvis, or we could have a dragon pretending to be a vampire, or something more unique and interesting than just a vampire, right? But here's the secret about uniqueness. Uniqueness can do 2 things. It can either make it easier to connect your content in compelling ways, or it can make it harder. And you need to understand for sure what your uniqueness is going to do before you add it. For example, Elvis Vampire would be a funny 1-session villain, but we wouldn't be able to come up with enough strong content easily enough and connect it well enough to make him compelling for 2 sessions. So that's not a very good example of uniqueness. We don't want to add that kind of uniqueness because it limits us. If we look at a story about a vampire lord, we can see where uniqueness was added to spice things up. Vampire Hunter D is a good example. Their villain is just a vampire lord, but they wanted a whole bunch of weird, zany fights, so they added in some uniqueness to their magic system. The uniqueness of their magic system allows them to thread together those fights in a compelling way. So what I'm getting at is, you don't need your stories to be unique right from the start. Unless you are deeply addicted to the idea of Vampire Elvis, you can just sort of let the uniqueness arrive when you need it, in my opinion. But we do have quite a lot of content to make. We have, 7 hours of content before we get to the Vampire Lord, so how do we fill those 7 hours? Well, some people will immediately start brainstorming up vampire-related content. Like, we'll have them fight ghouls, and werewolves, which are the same as ghouls but with ears, and we'll have a crumbling castle with a moon overhead, whatever, right? The thing about that is, if you're brainstorming up content, you are effectively creating a bunch of content that is directly related to the concept of a vampire, and you end up with a straight line pointing to a vampire. That's not a very compelling story. This is, I think, why people want to make more unique villains or whatever. They're worried about this pack of things that always comes attached to this concept, and they're worried that it's going to feel very tired if they just use those same concepts again. But here's the secret. You can use those concepts again, but you can't use them as your foundation. You don't want them to define your story. What defines your story are the arcs. We need an arc leading to the vampire lord. Once we have that arc, sure, we can attach the ghouls and the werewolves and whatever else, the crumbling castles, wherever we want that stuff. We can attach it to the arc, but it's not defining our story. It's just part of our story. That allows that kind of content to live in a place where it does good rather than dominating your story and making it feel flat. So what we really need are these arcs. We don't want to brainstorm up a bunch of content. We want to brainstorm up a bunch of arcs. How do you do that? What does that even mean? Well, an arc is something that the players can look forward to and sort of see where it's going, but they can't really tell. They can see the trajectory. They can see the trajectory is changing. They have ideas about where it might be going, but they don't know for sure where it's going. And similarly, at the end, they can look back and they can say, oh, look at all of that stuff. It makes perfect sense. Everything was leading up to this moment. This is why an arc is powerful, because it engages the player's sense of what's going to happen next and what happened before. It creates a through line, a context for all of your content. So an arc, in this case, is just something that the players can sort of predict. So we need to brainstorm up things the players can sort of predict. Well, that sounds like we need to brainstorm up some relationships, some activities, some things that change over the course of a typical story. So let's do that. How about in the village where the players first start, there is a church with a priest in it. This is an obvious vampire-related concept, right? The priests and the vampires always have a very rocky relationship for reasonably obvious reasons. So this could very easily be an arc. In an ordinary game, you might go to the priest and the priest will get you started on your storyline, but you then just leave the priest behind and you just forget about him. But if we consider the priest as an arc, we can consider how that priest's relationship to the story will change over time. And we can use it to define the priest, the vampire, and the story itself. It's a very powerful arc because it can do so much work for us. Now the question is, what is this relationship? Because we've just sort of dreamed up the basic idea that there is a priest, right? So what is the relationship that the priest has to the story? What is the relationship the priest has to the vampire? Don't we need to figure that out? No, we don't want to figure that out. Not yet. We're not brainstorming up content. We're brainstorming up arcs. The priest doesn't need to be defined at this point, any more than we've defined the villain. The villain is a vampire lord. We don't define him any more than that, and in the end he might not even be a vampire lord. He might change our minds. But there's the same thing here with the priest. All we need to know is that we have the priest token in play. He is going to be an arc. What are some other things that might become arcs? Well, how about the pool of victims that the vampires always have? We can treat them as an arc. We can just sort of say, well, the concept of victims is part of our arc. Over time, those victims will, die or turn into ghouls or whatever else happens, right? Depending on our player base and their sensibilities, these might be mostly children, or they might be women. They might be just a random cross-section of villagers. It depends on the sort of story we want to tell. But again, we don't have to come up with the details of that just yet. All we really have to know is that we can define the story by talking about the victims and how the victims change over time. Are there more victims? Less victims? Do they change into something? Do they become ghouls? We'll figure that out later. We're just brainstorming up arcs. What's another arc? Well, we know that vampires can't cross running water, so why don't we add in some running water? We'll have the village have a big old river, and we'll say that just off the top of our head, it's been raining for weeks. The river is flooding. Until now, it's been an empty riverbed. It doesn't usually have water in it, but now it's flowing. And that means the vampires can't get across the river. and they have to feed on the villagers because they're the only food on this part of the island, this side of the river. Something like that, right? And over the course of our adventure, the river can change. Waters can ebb, we can redirect the river, they can flood, we can have other things related to the river, like maybe there's wolves that can't cross the river, or maybe people trying to help the villagers can't cross the river. There are a lot of things we can do with this river, and we can create an arc of a flooding river. Now we can continue to brainstorm like this for however long we want, but just to show you how to start assembling these things, let's turn this into the first half of our story. How do we assemble these arcs? So the basic rule of arcs is that when they end, that is the most emotional beat of the arc. When the arc is over, this is where all of the emotion hits. Now you may reference the arc later, you may bring it up again, you may use it as a Chekhov's gun, but this is the moment when the entire weight of the arc is on the player's eyes. The player is feeling the arc. They know it. They're like, yeah, that's inevitability, man. I knew that was what was going to happen, or this is so cool that this is the way it happened. But you don't want to leave that emotion on the table. You want to immediately put it somewhere to keep the story going. Now you can let it linger. You can let the player sit on that emotion for a while, but you don't want to let it dissipate by moving on to something unrelated. So the most basic idea when we are planning using arcs is we are planning by having arcs that ram into other arcs, like this. This is the basic idea. And we can have a lot of different sort of sub-arcs that don't connect with other arcs and whatever we want, right? So in this fashion, we can create our story, keeping in mind that we're also going to form, relationships and references from finished arcs to other arcs and that sort of stuff as well. But those are things we can add later. Right now what we need is the core emotional flow of our story. So at this point, we have this arc of a vampire lord that we've got to fight. Blah. We have 3 arcs related to that. We've got the priest arc, we've got the victim's arc, and we've got the river arc. So how are we going to assemble them? Well, I think that the priest arc is probably one of the most critical. So just to do our brainstorming, we're going to start with having the priest arc come down into here. Something like this. Maybe even further along like this. With the idea being that whatever the priest is involved with, that's going to end up being deeply key to our final fight, to our final confrontation. So that arc is going to flow into the final confrontation. It's going to be deeply intertwined with this vampire hunting arc. Now, I think that if we think about the village's victims, we can start to think about what we want that to be. So how about we get a lot of victims that come back? Like we find a pack of victims. That can even be how we introduce the players to the village. They find a bunch of victims, and all of the victims are alive, but don't remember anything about the past week. So why did these victims survive while others did not? Why are there suddenly so many victims? And maybe the players are like, okay, clearly there's something wrong with these victims because whatever evil presence is around, then it's probably a vampire because there's a priest involved. They're not just going to leave food on the table. So are these victims going to turn into ghouls? What's going to go on here? And we can pipe that into our priest storyline. For example, we can say, oh, this priest, he is not very popular. His church, the village is very religious, but not with this church. This church is considered the bad church. Only a few people go to this church. These people. Oh, it turns out that the priest gave those people his blessing at their last communion, and that made their blood turn into fire for the vampires, or something similar to that, right? And that's why these people returned, because they had been blessed and the vampires couldn't touch them. And you're like, oh, we figured it out. We got it all working. Oh, shit. The priest has been kidnapped. So now the priest can't bless us. So you can see how we just pipe one arc into another arc. We have to define the priest first, obviously. We also define all these victims. And then when the victims come to their, with final realization, this is why they survived, we get a lot of that power going into the priest plotline because, oh, you're just a few minutes too late. The priest was just kidnapped. Shucks. This will allow us to quickly pipe the flow. And similarly, as we move through the downside of the priest arc, we need to connect that into the vampire arc. Like, do we rescue the priest? Do we have to find the priest's secret treasure? Do we have to turn the priest back from being a vampire or convince the priest, even if he is a vampire, he can break free of the vampiric domination or whatever? There's lots of things we can do on this downsweep, and then that will end up piping into the final confrontation, where whatever is left of the priest helps us to defeat the vampire lord. Basic stuff, right? And how about that river? Well, we can put the river wherever we want, but to me, I think that it probably deserves to be here. With the idea being that the arc of the river is something that we use in the early part of the game, where we're trying to build a rapport with the villagers. And they're saying, oh, the river is usually a riverbed. We don't have any sandbags or anything. We're not protected against this. If it floods anymore, the village could be at risk. And then we can work with the villagers to try and mitigate that risk while half of the village is sick with being a victim. They're unconscious or something. And so we're just working as hard as we can to help shore up the floods. And as we do that, we learn a lot about the nature of this priest and their relationship to the rest of the village. Now, all of these arcs are not actually done when they're done. This is when their emotional core is piped into another arc, but we can easily make callbacks. For example, all of those victims weren't all of the victims. They were just the survivors. Oh, would you look at that? Some of these are showing up again down here as ghouls, as new vampires, as part of the problem. And we can have another arc that connects to that. So we could have this arc here would be the local townie arc where the guys are so annoyed that you didn't rescue their wives or whatever, right? My baby was one of the missing ones and you didn't rescue them. You only rescued these worthless weirdos that go to that other church. And these two are connected because they have similar resonance, right? Different groups of people, same core cause. In this way, we can continue to start to work in more and more content. Like, oh, do we need more fights in the early game? Well, then let's go ahead and say that there are wolves trapped on this side of the new river. And the wolves are just as hungry as everything else. The vampires have started to feed on the villagers. Guess what? The wolves have also started to feed on the villagers' crops, or their various tasty animals. So you are called into action to help defeat the wolves, and that can pipe into the river, or the river can pipe into it, whichever we prefer. And again, we are building up rapport with the locals by helping them hunt down the wolves. And at the same time, we can learn that not all wolves are quite as easy to kill. There are some wolves in this place that don't die when you kill them. Fortunately, none of these wolves had that problem. Or maybe one did. Maybe you saw one of them heal up and crawl away. And that will allow us to create another arc that's connected to it, which would be the werewolf arc, right? Which might pipe in like this. The basic concept here is that we're creating these arcs where the player can see that things are unfolding, but it's not always going to be a linear straight shot. You've got to help the people with their wolf problem. Okay, the players are expecting some kind of twist, and you throw in some kind of little twist. Turns out that there are not just wolves, but werewolves. And in the process, they learn a lot about the village's problems and the village's people, and all of that pipes into the basic next arc that you need it to. You fought the wolves, but now there's an old man going, it doesn't matter if the wolves come or not, if everything floods and we're all underwater and we all die, you kids with your strong backs not doing shit about the real issues or whatever, right? We get that emotional flow from arc to arc to arc to arc to arc. This allows us to build up a story where all of the content feeds into a greater flow. All of the content ends up connected. And this works even better if you remember to connect your arcs to other arcs using callbacks or setups. Like, this arc here doesn't just stop the wolf menace entirely once you finish it. It also establishes the wolf menace as something that can come back later as a new arc. This is a very basic way to build your RPG stories, and it works really well because it doesn't take very much time, and you can just keep adding new arcs wherever you need them by simply brainstorming up what could possibly feed into this story at this point. Do we need angry villagers? Well, what can we make the villagers angry about that will end up feeding into one of our already established arcs? Do we need monsters? What sort of monsters can we put into the woods that will feed into one of our other arcs? Now, the idea behind this is that this is just going to be session 1, right? This part is session 1. We stop the session with the kidnapping of the priest, because that will give the players something to think about while they are not playing the game. In between sessions, they'll be like, oh crap, we need to figure out where the priest went, and so on and so forth. But this comes with a couple of caveats, because as we've said several times, the reason these arcs exist is to let the players look forward down the arc. They want to know where things are going. They want to try and figure it out ahead of time and predict what's going to happen. And we're really pretty sparse on the number of arcs that cross this divide. We don't have a lot of arcs in motion. So we want to make sure that we have more arcs that have already been brought up. For example, maybe what we have is this wolf thing doesn't actually feed into the river thing at all. Instead, the wolf thing is going to feed into a different, longer-term arc. So we'll pull that off of the river, and we'll just come up with a different arc. For example, how about this arc here? This arc here will be the abandoned castle under the moonlight arc, with the idea being that this is some kind of weird ghost castle that nothing living can approach. And you can have this told to you while you're hunting wolves. You can see the arc, you can see the castle, and he's like, yeah, nothing living can reach that castle. You've got to be dead or cursed. And I'm not either one unless you count my wife. Something like that, right? So in this way, we can build up this castle as something the players need to be able to get to eventually. But by the time the first session is ended, they haven't figured out how. How do you get to a place that can only be approached if you're dead or cursed? The priest can do the opposite of that. The priest can bless you, right? But he can't curse you. So how are you going to solve that? Maybe we get a vampire on our side to lead us. Well, how did these people get back? How did these people get to the castle? How did they get from the castle? If they got there, there's got to be a way to get there. Oh, they were led there by a vampire, whatever, right? We can work out all of those details in a way that flows very naturally into whatever arc we want them to connect to. And as long as the players have something to think about between sessions, they're going to be excited for the next session. That's the power of arcs. This is just a very basic overview of how to brainstorm up a story for an RPG. Now, just to remind you, one of the biggest strengths of this approach is that these arcs are not set in stone. We can change them if we need to change them. We can even change them on the fly if it's a tabletop RPG. We can bring in scenes here or here or here or here, wherever we need them to go. And because these arcs are conceptual, not physical, we can go ahead and redirect an arc if it turns out that we need to do emergency repairs on something. Like if it turns out that we need to radically change the way that these villagers are working. Like the players decided that they wanted the priest to bless them. And so they're, priest, bless us, bless us, bless us. And you've already worked out, we can't let that happen to the players because they've got to be in danger. So you might have to perform an emergency appendectomy where the priest gets magically kidnapped out of the middle of nowhere, and you've got to struggle to figure out why. Why was he kidnapped? Who kidnapped him? Well, it turns out that the victims did, because they finally turned into ghouls. Just throw away that entire sub-arc. We don't need it to complete this story because the players have changed their direction. They've changed their vector. We can just grab one of those other angles, wrench it down, and make it work, and it will work. It won't be quite as clean as if things had unfolded as we had seen fit, but because we understand how the story needs to go in general, we can grab whatever arcs are nearby and yank them into alignment if we need an emergency fix. I hope this was educational or fun. Obviously, this is not an advanced technique for doing amazing things. It's just a basic way to brainstorm up a story, but I see a lot of people struggling with this basic idea. How do I put together the content? How do I thread it together in a compelling way? So I figured I would show you a basic structure to allow you to do that. Have a good one.